The Krylonian Empire's first mistake was assuming that silence meant weakness. For 3,000 cycles, they had expanded through the galaxy with mechanical precision. Their process was perfect, tested across 1,000 worlds. Identify, assess, integrate. The strong became allies, the weak became subjects, and the defiant became examples. It was a system that had never failed, until they found Earth. Supreme Commander Nexer stood before the Imperial Council, his crystalline exoskeleton reflecting the harsh light of the chamber's illumination fields. The planet designated Sol 3 presents minimal strategic value, he reported, gesturing to the holographic display of a blue-green world. Their global communication network broadcasts their capabilities openly. They remain dependent on fossil fuels, maintain primitive nuclear arsenals, and their space presence is limited to their own solar system. The council members chittered in amusement. Such transparency was typically a sign of a civilization too naive to survive first contact. Every advanced species knew to guard their capabilities, to shroud their strengths in secrecy. The humans broadcast their military exercises, shared their technological achievements, and openly debated their weaknesses on public channels. Their military forces are fragmented among nearly 200 sovereign entities, Nexer continued. They have no unified planetary defense system, no orbital weapons platforms, and their most advanced AI systems barely qualify as sentient by Imperial standards. High Counselor Vexor's feeding tentacles curled in satisfaction. Standard integration protocols. Recommended and approved, Nexer confirmed. Our analysis suggests a 97% chance of successful integration within one standard cycle. What the Empire failed to understand was that Earth's apparent fragmentation wasn't weakness, it was diversity. Each nation, each culture, each individual approached problems differently. While the Empire had spent millennia perfecting a single way of doing things, humanity had been experimenting with thousands. The integration fleet arrived on a Tuesday. Humanity's response began on Wednesday. The Empire's first signal was meant to be overwhelming. A simultaneous broadcast to every electronic device on Earth, displaying the mighty Imperial fleet in high orbit. It was designed to inspire awe, to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Instead, within hours, the signal was being remixed into memes. Teenagers on social media were adding cartoon sound effects to footage of the Imperial ships. Late-night comedy shows were already writing jokes about how the aliens looked like angry space lobsters. The Empire's second signal was more direct, a formal demand for Earth's surrender, delivered in perfect English, Mandarin, Hindi, Spanish, and Arabic, the planet's 5 most spoken languages. The responses came in over 4,000 languages, but they all meant essentially the same thing: no. What happened next would be studied in Imperial military academies for generations, not as a model of success, but as a cautionary tale. The Empire deployed its standard subjugation fleet, 10,000 ships, each carrying troops and equipment that had successfully conquered dozens of worlds. They expected Earth's militaries to respond according to doctrine, to follow the conventional patterns of planetary defense that the Empire had encountered countless times before. Instead, they got chaos. Indian cybersecurity experts hijacked Imperial targeting systems using codes borrowed from Pakistani hackers. Brazilian drone operators collaborated with Iranian AI researchers to create electronic warfare techniques that the Empire had never encountered. Finnish snipers shared tactics with Kenyan special forces, while Vietnamese guerrilla warfare veterans advised NATO commanders. But the Empire's greatest miscalculation wasn't about Earth's military capabilities. It was about human nature itself. The Empire's psychological warfare tactics, designed to demoralize and divide, had the opposite effect. Their threats united humanity in ways that no internal crisis ever had. Their attempts to play nations against each other were met with unprecedented cooperation. Their offers of preferential treatment to collaborators were leaked online and turned into viral videos mocking their transparency. By the end of the first week, the Empire had lost 30 ships, not to Earth's military forces, but to civilian hackers who had figured out how to trigger their emergency evacuation protocols. The ship's automated systems, convinced they were experiencing catastrophic failures, simply abandoned their crews and returned to Imperial space. Commander Nexar watched in horror as his carefully planned invasion dissolved into chaos. His reports to the Imperial Council became increasingly desperate as he tried to explain how a primitive civilization was systematically dismantling the most powerful military force in known space. The truth was becoming clear. The Empire had mistaken Earth's openness for naivety, its diversity for division, and its apparent technological backwardness for actual limitation. They had failed to understand that humans didn't follow a single doctrine because they had never stopped innovating, never stopped experimenting, never stopped imagining new ways to overcome challenges. As the first month drew to a close, the Empire was faced with an uncomfortable reality. Their perfect record of planetary integration was about to end. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that humanity wasn't just resisting. They were taking notes. The Empire's second month on Earth began with a revelation that shook the foundations of imperial military doctrine. Humans had been preparing for this war their entire lives. They just hadn't known it. Supreme Commander Nexar stood in his command center, his crystalline form dulled with stress as he reviewed the latest intelligence. "Explain to me," he demanded of his chief analyst, "how they developed countermeasures so quickly." The analyst's report was disturbing. "Sir, they'd already imagined them. Years ago, sometimes decades ago. We found thousands of what they call science fiction stories that perfectly predicted our tactical approaches. They've been solving these problems hypothetically for generations." What the Empire didn't understand was that every human child who had ever pointed a stick and pretended it was a laser gun, every teenager who had played a space warfare simulation game, every author who had written about alien invasions, they had all been unwittingly contributing to Earth's defensive capabilities. The humans' response to Imperial technology was equally baffling. Instead of trying to match the Empire's advanced systems, they found ways to use their existing technology in ways the Empire had never considered possible. When Imperial ships deployed their quantum-lock shields, human engineers didn't try to break through them. Instead, they developed what they called shield ticklers, swarms of small drones that would vibrate at precisely the right frequency to make the shields uncomfortable for the crystalline Krylonian crews to maintain. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The Empire's biomechanical computers, far more advanced than Earth's digital systems, were suddenly vulnerable to what humans called analog hacks. A group of Russian teenagers discovered that playing certain frequencies of hard bass music through hijacked Imperial communication channels could cause the organic components of their computers to become nauseated and shut down. But perhaps most shocking was how humans treated combat itself. The Empire had spent millennia perfecting the art of space warfare, developing intricate formations and protocols. Humans, on the other hand, fought like they were making it up as they went along, because they were. A fleet of fishing boats off the coast of Vietnam confused Imperial sensors by dumping thousands of mirrors into the ocean, creating false readings that scattered their targeting systems. Australian submarine crews discovered that Imperial ships couldn't distinguish between actual submarines and pods of whales, so they began using marine wildlife migrations as cover for their movements. In orbit, things were even stranger. The joint mission between SpaceX and the European Space Agency turned a dozen communication satellites into what they called a space kaleidoscope, using precisely arranged mirrors to create phantom images of Earth's defense fleet. Imperial gunners found themselves firing at targets that didn't exist, while actual Earth vessels slipped past their defenses. The humans' greatest weapon, however, wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was their ability to share information. Every victory, every discovered weakness, every successful strategy was immediately broadcast across the planet. The Empire's strict hierarchical command structure couldn't adapt fast enough to the rapidly evolving battlefield. "They're not fighting a war," Nexar realized one day. watching footage of civilians using consumer drones to deliver supplies through Imperial blockades. They're solving a puzzle, and they're enjoying it. The Empire's warriors, trained from birth in the art of combat, found themselves facing opponents who treated warfare like a creative challenge. Humans didn't follow the rules of engagement because they didn't believe such rules existed. They approached each battle like a game where the only rule was survival. A particular incident highlighted this difference perfectly. An Imperial dreadnought, pride of the fleet, was disabled by what appeared to be a computer virus. When Imperial technicians finally isolated the code, they discovered it was actually a modified version of an Earth computer game called Space Invaders. The virus had convinced the ship's defense systems that they were playing a game, and they were losing. As the second month drew to a close, the Empire's casualties weren't just military. Their entire understanding of warfare was being systematically dismantled. Every doctrine, every strategy, every assumption about how combat should work was being challenged by a species that treated the impossible as merely inconvenient. But the Empire's greatest concern wasn't the battles they were losing. It was the battles yet to come. Because with each passing day, humanity wasn't just learning how to fight the Krylonians. They were learning how to fight any advanced civilization. And they were teaching others. The Empire's perfect record of planetary integration wasn't just about to end. It was about to become a handbook for revolution. The Empire's third month of the Earth campaign began with an emergency session of the Imperial Council. The topic wasn't their mounting losses or failed strategies. It was a simple question that threatened to unravel their entire technological civilization. What if they had been advancing in the wrong direction? High Counselor Vexor's feeding tentacles writhed in distress as she reviewed the latest reports. The humans weren't just refusing to be overwhelmed by Imperial technology. They were systematically demonstrating its weaknesses using tools that the Empire had considered obsolete centuries ago. The incident that triggered this crisis of confidence became known as the Grandfather Clock Gambit. When Imperial forces deployed their most advanced chronometric disruption fields, weapons designed to create localized time distortions, they found their effects neutralized by networks of simple mechanical clocks. The humans had discovered that the Empire's temporal weapons relied on digital time measurements and could be confused by analog alternatives. They're not trying to match our technology, one Imperial scientist reported, their crystalline form clouded with confusion. They're going around it, through it, sometimes backwards. It defies all logical progression. The Empire had always assumed that technological advancement was linear, that newer meant better, more complex meant more capable. Humans rejected this assumption entirely. They used whatever worked, regardless of its age or origin. When Imperial ships deployed quantum entanglement communication systems that were supposed to be unhackable, Earth's response wasn't to try to break the encryption. Instead, they used old-fashioned radio signals, which the Empire's advanced systems had long ago lost the ability to detect. Humans passed crucial military intelligence through social media posts about cat videos and recipe blogs, hiding their meaning in plain sight using cultural references that Imperial eye couldn't decipher. The Empire's biomechanical enhanced soldiers, products of centuries of genetic engineering, found themselves outmaneuvered by human special forces using techniques developed by ancient hunters. Their crystal-based quantum computers were corrupted by electromagnetic pulses generated by technology the humans had mastered in the 1940s. But perhaps the most humiliating revelation came from what humans called the Internet of Things. The Empire had dismissed Earth's network of interconnected civilian devices as primitive and irrelevant. Then human hackers turned millions of smart home devices into a distributed sensor network that tracked Imperial ship movements with terrifying accuracy. "Their refrigerators are spying on us," one Imperial commander reported in disbelief. "Their doorbells are recording our troop movements. Their children's toys are monitoring our communications." The Empire's warriors, accustomed to fighting enemies who tried to match their technological superiority, found themselves facing opponents who simply refused to play by those rules. When Imperial forces deployed energy shields that could stop any known weapon, humans responded with nets and foam. When they used advanced stealth technology, humans tracked them by measuring disruptions in bird migration patterns and changes in local weather. A particularly clever group of university students in Kenya discovered that Imperial cloaking devices, while invisible to all modern detection systems, created subtle disruptions in AM radio signals, technology so old that the Empire had never bothered to account for it. Soon, networks of vintage radio enthusiasts were providing more accurate tracking of Imperial movements than the most advanced military sensors. The Empire's technological pride suffered its greatest blow when they discovered that their most sophisticated biological weapons, viruses designed to target specific genetic markers, were being defeated by human immune systems that had been strengthened by millennia of exposure to Earth's remarkably hostile biological environment. What the Empire saw as primitive medical technology was actually the result of countless generations of natural adaptation. They're not less advanced, one Imperial researcher finally concluded. They're differently advanced. They never stopped using their old tools, never abandoned working solutions just because something newer came along. They have the entire technological spectrum at their disposal, and they know how to use all of it. As the third month drew to a close, the Empire was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their technological superiority, the foundation of their civilizational identity, might actually be a form of vulnerability. They had become so dependent on their advanced systems, so convinced of the superiority of their progress, that they had forgotten the value of simplicity. Meanwhile, humanity continued to demonstrate that innovation wasn't about having the newest technology. It was about using whatever tools you had in ways your opponent never expected. And they were getting better at it every day. The Empire had always believed that primitive technology meant a primitive civilization. Now they were learning, at tremendous cost, that sometimes the oldest solutions were the most effective, especially when applied by a species that had never stopped learning new ways to use them. The Empire's fourth month battling Earth marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Great Awakening. What had started as a simple planetary integration was evolving into something far more dangerous, an idea. Supreme Commander Nexer knew something was wrong when reports of unrest began flowing in from previously stable Imperial worlds. The humans hadn't just been fighting the Empire. They'd been broadcasting their successes, complete with detailed instructions, across every frequency they could access. They're teaching others how to resist, Nexer reported to the Imperial Council, his crystalline form nearly opaque with stress. Not just military tactics, they're showing them how to think differently. The Empire had always maintained control through technological superiority and cultural isolation. Subject species were kept separated, allowed to advance only along carefully controlled paths. But humans had changed that equation. They had proven that resistance wasn't about having the best technology, it was about having the best ideas. A civilization of methane-breathing giants on the Empire's outer rim successfully replicated Earth's shield tickler technology using modified atmospheric processors. A species of photosynthetic humanoids adapted human guerrilla warfare tactics to their forest world, using their natural bioluminescence to create false targets that confused Imperial targeting systems. But it wasn't just military knowledge that was spreading. Earth's cultural transmissions, their music, their art, their stories, were having an even more profound effect. Species that had been subjugated for generations were beginning to ask dangerous questions. Why do we follow the Empire's path? Why can't we find our own way? The Empire's response was predictable. They attempted to block Earth's transmissions, but humanity had spent centuries developing ways to bypass censorship. Their messages hopped between frequencies, hitched rides on Imperial commercial traffic, and spread through networks of converted Imperial communication relays. The resistance took different forms on different worlds. Some civilizations engaged in open rebellion, while others adopted more subtle forms of defiance. A species of silicon-based crystalline beings, physically similar to the Krylonians themselves, began producing art that depicted alternative futures, a form of protest that the Empire had never encountered and struggled to suppress. What made Earth's influence so dangerous was its emphasis on diversity and adaptation. They weren't telling other species to fight like humans. They were showing them how to fight like themselves, using their own unique abilities and environments to their advantage. A water world that had been providing the Empire with vital mineral resources suddenly became impossible to control when its aquatic inhabitants adapted human submarine tactics to their entire planet. A high-gravity species that had been used as labor force turned their natural strength into an advantage using human martial arts principles. But perhaps most disturbing to the Empire was how Earth handled victory. When they succeeded in liberating an Imperial outpost or freeing a subjugated species, they didn't impose their own rule. Instead, they offered knowledge, shared resources, and then stepped back to let others find their own path. "They're not trying to replace us," one Imperial analyst realized with horror. "They're trying to make us irrelevant." The Empire's carefully maintained hierarchy was being replaced by something new. A network of diverse civilizations, each developing in its own way while sharing knowledge and resources. The humans called it the Galactic Internet, and it was growing faster than the Empire could control. Even more alarming was how Earth's influence affected Imperial citizens themselves. Young Krylonians began questioning traditional doctrines, experimenting with new forms of art and technology that blended Imperial and human influences. Some even began modifying their crystalline bodies in ways that reflected human aesthetic principles, a form of rebellion that deeply disturbed their elders. The Empire had faced rebellions before, but they had always been predictable. A species would develop sufficient technology to challenge Imperial rule, attempt to match the Empire's military might, and ultimately fail. But this was different. Earth wasn't trying to become the new Empire. They were showing the galaxy that empires themselves were obsolete. As the fourth month drew to a close, the Imperial Council faced an unprecedented crisis. Their military superiority was crumbling, their cultural dominance was fading, and their very way of life was being challenged not by force, but by something far more dangerous: choice. The humans had introduced the concept of alternatives into a galaxy that had known only one path for millennia. And once that idea took root, there was no way to contain it. The Empire had wanted to integrate Earth into their civilization. Instead, Earth was integrating the galaxy into something entirely new. A future where diversity wasn't just tolerated, but celebrated, where progress wasn't measured by technological advancement alone, but by the freedom to choose one's own path. And the Empire was beginning to realize that they couldn't stop it. Because you can't quarantine an idea, can't suppress a dream, can't contain hope once it's been released into the universe. The Empire's fifth month never came. Instead, the Imperial Council found themselves doing something unprecedented, negotiating their own transformation. Supreme Commander Nexer stood before the Council for what would be his final report, his crystalline form clear and calm for the first time in months. He had finally understood what the humans had known all along. True strength wasn't about domination, it was about adaptation. "The Empire as we know it is finished," he stated simply. But perhaps that's not a defeat. Perhaps it's an evolution. The statistics were undeniable. 30% of Imperial worlds were in open revolt. Another 40% had begun implementing what humans called democratic reforms. The remaining 30% weren't loyal. They were waiting to see what would happen next. But it was the cultural transformation that truly marked the end of the old empire. Krylonian youth were organizing what they called mixed species innovation forums, combining imperial technology with ideas from dozens of different civilizations. Former subject species were establishing their own universities, research centers, and cultural exchanges. The humans, surprisingly, weren't celebrating their victory. Instead, they were offering to help manage the transition. They had experience. They explained, with the challenges of moving from autocracy to democracy, from isolation to interconnection. They had made every mistake possible on their own world and learned from each one. "We're not here to rule," Earth's representatives explained during the historic first meeting of what would become the Galactic Council. "We're here to share. Every species has something to teach, and everyone has something to learn." The Empire's vast bureaucracy, built over millennia to maintain control, was repurposed into what humans called an intergalactic internet, a network for sharing knowledge, culture, and resources across species and systems. Imperial warships were converted into exploration vessels, their crews now mixed species teams dedicated to scientific discovery rather than conquest. Former Imperial assessment protocols, once used to categorize species for conquest, were transformed into cultural exchange programs. The Empire's extensive databases, previously used to maintain control, became the foundation for the largest free library in known space. But perhaps the most profound change was in how different species began to view themselves and each other. The Empire's rigid hierarchy was replaced by something more organic, a network of civilizations, each developing in their own way while contributing to the greater whole. The Krylonians themselves underwent the most dramatic transformation. Their crystalline forms, once uniform symbols of imperial power, became canvases for individual expression. Young Krylonians began incorporating artistic elements from other species, creating new forms of beauty that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Earth's influence was everywhere, not as a dominant force, but as a catalyst for change. Human music merged with alien harmonies to create new forms of art. Human stories blended with alien mythologies to explore new ways of understanding the universe. Human scientific methods combined with alien perspectives to solve problems that neither could have tackled alone. A particularly touching moment came when a group of former Imperial scientists published what they called an apology to the universe, a detailed analysis of how their pursuit of technological superiority had blinded them to the value of diversity. It became required reading in schools across the galaxy. The humans had a phrase for what had happened. Task failed successfully. The Empire had set out to integrate Earth into their civilization and had instead integrated the entire galaxy into something new, something better. 5 years after the failed invasion of Earth, the last Imperial governor resigned their position. But they didn't step down in defeat. Instead, they became the first chairperson of their planet's newly elected council, their crystalline form gleaming with colors borrowed from a dozen different species' artistic traditions. The empire that had ruled for millennia was gone. In its place was something unprecedented, a civilization that measured its strength not by its ability to conquer, but by its capacity to connect, not by its power to dominate, but by its willingness to learn. And Earth kept doing what it had always done, questioning, exploring, creating, sharing. But now it had an entire galaxy of partners in that endeavor. The humans had a saying that became popular across the former empire. The best way to predict the future is to create it together. The galaxy would never be the same. But then again, that had been the point all along. Because in the end, the greatest power in the universe wasn't technology or military might, or even knowledge itself. It was the ability to imagine something better, and the courage to make it real.